Detroit, Michigan. August 14th, 1996. On a sweltering summer afternoon, Franklin Doyle, 62 years old, a former transport union leader, left his modest home in Royal Oak. He wore a crisp white shirt, an old faded tie, and carried a brown leather briefcase stuffed with union files. He told his wife he'd be home for dinner, but that was the last time she ever saw him. His dark blue sedan was later found in the parking lot of La Strada, an Italian restaurant in Bloomfield Hills. The doors were locked, the keys still in the ignition. On the back seat lay the briefcase, filled with names, loans, and suspicious cash flows. In the ashtray, a half-smoked Marlboro, its ash still trembling. But Frank himself had vanished. No blood, no witnesses, just a chilling void and a question that has haunted Detroit for decades. Who took him, and why? This is one of the most mysterious disappearances ever to strike Detroit, now frozen in history as a cold case. If you want to uncover the truth behind America's most haunting, unsolved crimes, make sure to subscribe, follow, and hit the bell icon, because sometimes the truth is far scarier than fiction. Detroit, Michigan. The year was 1996. In a city where the echo of machinery once rattled through every street and the air still hung heavy with the ghosts of the Motor City's prime, a different kind of thunder rolled beneath the surface. Abandoned factories stood as rusted tombstones, graffiti clawing up their brick sides, while grass forced its way through cracked concrete. Empty parking lots shimmered with heat and menace. Here, in the spaces where hope had been choked out, a war of shadows raged. One of unions, secrets, and debts that could never be repaid. Franklin Frank Doyle, at age 62, stood at the edge of his tidy front yard in the Detroit suburb of Royal Oak. He watched a pair of squirrels fight over a crust of bread on the sidewalk. Behind him, his wife Marilyn shuffled quietly in the kitchen, the radio low, the house still. Frank was a broad-shouldered man, his once black hair now streaked with steel gray. There was a tiredness to him that went deeper than wrinkles. Prison would do that to a man. But inside, where it counted, something still burned, a cinder that refused to die. Frank had once been a name to be feared and respected across Detroit. Years ago, he'd led the most powerful transport union in the state, a king among working men, able to bring the city to a standstill with a single phone call. The newspapers called him a hero for the people. The bosses and mobsters called him a pain in the ass. Eventually, someone called the feds. It was a white-collar crime, they said. Embezzlement, wire fraud, moving money that wasn't his. Frank maintained he'd been set up, but the judge had no patience for old battles. 6 years. He'd served 5, kept his mouth shut, and came out to a world that barely remembered him. But there's something about men like Frank. Even after everything has been stripped away, money, influence, reputation, ambition claws at the ribs. He'd watched the union from the sidelines, watching the new men take their turns at the table. They were weak, Frank thought. Some were bought, others simply afraid. Rumors swirled about mob money, envelopes passed in back rooms, contracts that mysteriously went missing. He'd seen it all before, and it made his blood boil. He wanted one last shot, not just for himself, but for all the men breaking their backs while the bosses skimmed from the top. To reclaim the throne would mean war, but Frank had never backed down from a fight, even when the odds were impossible. On this sticky summer morning, Frank paced his living room, weighing the risks. He kept folders and notebooks hidden in a battered briefcase. Details of suspicious loans, lists of men who'd suddenly gotten rich, notes about meetings at dim-lit restaurants. Marilyn watched him sometimes. Worry etched into her face. "Let it go, Frank," she'd whisper, clutching his arm at night, fear settling between them like a third body. But Frank could no more let go than he could stop breathing. A black sedan slowed outside his house, pausing just long enough to send a message, then rolled on. Frank didn't flinch. He knew the signals, warnings, sometimes threats. One night, someone slashed the tires on his old Buick. Another time, a dead pigeon was left on his porch, its neck twisted. Mob games, the same old script. But if anything, it hardened his resolve. Every so often, he would drive past the riverfront, letting the sight of the city's battered skyline stoke his anger and purpose. He would recall how it felt to walk into the Union Hall, every head turning, every conversation stopping when he entered. He'd been a king once. Detroit was a city that chewed men up and spit them out, but Frank wasn't done fighting yet. One evening, Frank met quietly with a handful of old allies, men who remembered what he'd done for them, who owed him favors, or simply shared his disgust with the corruption that now stained the Union. They huddled in the corner booth of a dark, smoky bar. Frank's voice was a low growl. "We take it back, piece by piece, but we need proof, names, dates, money trails. I know who's pulling the strings, and I'm not afraid to call them out." But such plans never stayed secret for long. Word filtered through the city's underbelly. Frank Doyle was making moves again. Some saw hope. Others, especially those with blood on their hands, saw a problem that needed fixing. Frank knew the risk. He kept his routines tight, his circle small, but the feeling of being watched never left him. At night, he stared out the bedroom window, the hum of distant traffic like a warning. Marilyn asked him, more than once, to walk away before it was too late. But in the morning, Frank would knot his tie and look at himself in the bathroom mirror, older, grayer, but still unbroken. The city itself seemed to sense the tension. News stories about union corruption flickered on the evening broadcasts, reporters hinting at investigations, names whispered but never spoken on air. The union was a fortress, guarded by more than just locked doors. Its real power was in what men were willing to do to keep secrets buried. Frank was not naive. He knew the darkness he was stepping into, the enemies waiting in the shadows. But there are men who cannot ignore the call of unfinished business, even when it might destroy them. For Frank Doyle, this was more than pride. It was redemption, justice, and the hope of lighting one last fire in a city gone cold. In the thick Detroit air, with thunderclouds gathering far to the west, Frank Doyle set his mind to the battle ahead. He had one last play to make. And as the sun set behind the ruins of the old factories, a man once broken by power dared to reach for it again, even as every sign warned him. This time, the darkness would not let go so easily. August 14th, 1996. Detroit shimmered under a late summer sun, the air thick with humidity and the tang of car exhaust. By mid-morning, Frank Doyle was already up, his morning ritual measured and methodical, a habit left over from the years he spent behind bars. He laid out a crisp white shirt and knotted an old faded tie. His hair, thinning and gray, was combed back neatly. Each movement was deliberate, as if clothing himself in armor for whatever lay ahead. Marilyn, his wife of 40 years, watched him from the doorway of their small, tidy kitchen. She set down a cup of coffee, her eyes searching his face for any hint that today might be different. Frank offered her a reassuring smile, but even she could sense the tension threading through the house. He told her only that he had lunch plans with old friends and would be home by dinner. It was the kind of half-truth that hung heavy in the air, weighted with all the things left unsaid. Marilyn reached for his hand, squeezing it just once. Frank squeezed back, a silent promise. By noon, Frank drove his dark blue sedan out of Royal Oak, winding north through the suburbs. The city gave way to well-kept lawns and brick storefronts, the kind of place where Detroit's old money liked to hide from the scars of downtown. His destination, La Strada, an Italian restaurant in Bloomfield Hills. The restaurant was well known, the kind of place that thrived on regulars and under-the-table deals, where politicians and businessmen shook hands in the dim light, and nobody ever asked too many questions. The security cameras out front were a new addition, signs of the times, perhaps, or a simple nod to paranoia. They captured Frank's arrival just before 1 o'clock. He parked neatly, checked his watch, and lit a Marlboro, the smoke curling up around his face. The camera caught the flicker of the lighter, the way his shoulders rose and fell with a long exhale. For a few minutes, he stood outside his car, eyes scanning the parking lot, always aware, always cautious. Then he walked toward the entrance, his stride steady but his mind racing. Inside La Strada, the air was cool and smelled faintly of garlic and old leather. Waiters moved with practiced efficiency, gliding between linen-draped tables and booths set deep in the shadows. Frank nodded to the maitre d', who recognized him from better days and led him to a corner table away from prying eyes. Frank sat with his back to the wall, a habit born of necessity, watching the door, watching everyone. Lunch passed in a haze of low voices and shifting faces. He met with two men, one a former union colleague, the other a local business owner rumored to have connections with people best left unnamed. Their conversation was businesslike, focused. Names and numbers, promises, caution, always caution. Frank listened, probed, measured their words, searching for any sign of betrayal. He felt the weight of eyes on him, imagined threats in the shadows behind every pillar. In this world, trust was an expensive luxury. After the meal, Frank lingered for a moment at the bar, sipping a glass of water, scanning the faces around him. A young couple argued quietly in one booth. A group of men in suits laughed too loudly near the back. Outside, the sun glared off windshields in the lot. Frank checked his watch again. Almost 2 o'clock. He stepped out into the parking lot, the heavy door thudding shut behind him. The security camera captured him standing beside his sedan, reaching into his pocket for another cigarette. He lit it, took a slow drag, and glanced at his watch one last time. For a long moment, he just stood there, bathed in sunlight and shadow, as if weighing a final decision. Then, as if drawn by some invisible thread, Frank slipped out of frame. He moved past the range of the camera, disappearing behind a row of parked cars, and was never seen again. Inside the restaurant, life moved on. Waiters reset tables, polished glasses, and prepared for the dinner crowd. Nobody noticed that Frank Doyle, so recently at the heart of whispered deals and promises, was gone. His sedan remained in the lot, untouched. The last evidence of his presence, a thin trail of smoke rising from a half-burned Marlboro in the ashtray. As afternoon faded into evening, Marilyn set the table for dinner, glancing at the clock more often than usual. Each passing hour deepened her unease, the silence of the house pressing in on her. The phone rang twice, both times wrong numbers, each a fresh jolt of hope and fear. By 10 o'clock, she knew something was wrong. Frank never stayed out late without calling, not since the day he came home from prison. Not since he'd promised her there would be no more secrets. Night settled over Detroit like a heavy blanket. At La Strada, the lights in the parking lot flickered on, illuminating the empty sedan, its windows reflecting the distant neon. Somewhere beyond the reach of cameras and witnesses, Franklin Doyle had vanished, swallowed by a city that kept its secrets and devoured those who dared to disturb its uneasy peace. The next morning dawned gray and heavy over Detroit, a drizzle clinging to the cracked sidewalks and casting everything in a dull, listless light. For the city, it was just another workday, machines groaning back to life in surviving factories, commuters fighting through traffic, the news murmuring about unions and missing men in the background. But for those who knew Frank Doyle, dread had begun to set in. Marilyn sat alone at the kitchen table, untouched coffee cooling beside her trembling hands. The hours of the previous night had blurred together, calls to friends, worried questions with no answers, the slow realization that Frank was not coming home. When the doorbell finally rang just after sunrise, her heart pounded. 2 police officers stood on her stoop, their faces carefully neutral. She braced herself for the worst. "Mrs. Doyle," the older one began, "did your husband come home last night?" His partner quietly took notes as Marilyn explained, her voice barely above a whisper, that he'd gone to lunch and never returned. There was a nod, the kind that meant they'd heard this before, but something in the officer's eyes betrayed the gravity of the situation. In this city, when men like Frank Doyle went missing, it was never simple. By mid-morning, a cruiser rolled into the parking lot of La Strada. The restaurant was nearly empty, the staff busy sweeping floors and setting tables for another day. The sedan, dark blue and dusted with rain, sat untouched in its space, looking almost ordinary. But to Detective Sandra Briggs, nothing about it felt right. She circled the vehicle, making notes. The doors were locked, the windows clear, no sign of a struggle, no blood or shattered glass. Yet the car itself was an island of silence in a world that thrummed with secrets. The key was still in the ignition, a detail that felt oddly intimate, as if Frank had intended to come right back. On the back seat, partially hidden beneath a gray overcoat, sat a brown leather briefcase. Briggs pulled on gloves, opened the door with a soft click, and retrieved the case. It was heavy, stuffed with folders and notebooks, papers scribbled with names, loan numbers, and columns of figures that meant little to an outsider but would set off alarm bells for anyone familiar with Detroit's union politics. Tucked among the records were scraps of paper, meeting times, cryptic initials, arrows pointing from one name to another. It was a roadmap of power, of debts and secrets traded like currency. On the passenger seat, an open pack of Marlboro cigarettes. In the ashtray, a single half-smoked Marlboro, burned out mid-draw. A curl of gray ash trailing toward the floor mat. It felt like a frozen moment. Someone interrupted, yanked out of ordinary life into something darker. There was no note, no sign of a goodbye. Only the briefcase hinted at why someone might want him gone. Detectives combed the lot for evidence. Security footage from the restaurant showed Frank's arrival, his anxious scan of the parking lot, the way he lingered by his car before finally entering. The cameras offered nothing after 2 p.m. Frank simply vanished from the lens, as if the city itself had swallowed him whole. Inside the restaurant, staff remembered him, the way old regulars do, polite, reserved, eyes always moving. Nobody remembered him leaving. Nobody remembered seeing him with anyone unusual. It was as if he'd stepped off the edge of the world. News of Frank's disappearance traveled fast. At the precinct, phones rang with calls from union members, journalists, and men with voices too smooth and urgent. Every rumor was treated as a potential lead, every whisper as a threat. The briefcase became the focus of speculation. Some said it was a bargaining chip, evidence to bring down the men who now controlled the union. Others said it was nothing, a red herring to distract from something darker. But those papers, with their names and secret cash funds, were proof that Frank had been digging into things best left buried. Briggs and her team scoured the car for clues, a single strand of long, dark hair on the back seat, a faint fingerprint on the dashboard, but nothing concrete. There were no footprints, no signs of violence, not a drop of blood. It was a vanishing act, clean and chilling. The media latched onto the story. Headlines blared about a union boss gone missing in broad daylight, the dark undertones of mob involvement, and corruption reaching into every corner of the city. Reporters hounded Marilyn, camping outside her house, their cameras waiting for tears or revelations. She answered only with grief and denial. Frank would never abandon his family, she repeated, voice raw from sleepless nights. He's not that kind of man. As the days passed, the silence around Frank's disappearance grew heavier, thick with suspicion and fear. The police worked their leads, turning over every stone, but the city seemed to conspire against them. There were no confessions, no convenient witnesses, only the ghost of a man who had fought too hard and known too much. The briefcase was catalogued, its contents pored over again and again. Names were cross-checked, alibis tested. Still, the puzzle refused to yield. Detroit, always a city of hard truths and darker lies, closed its grip tighter, daring anyone to pull at the threads. In the end, there was only the car, rain-speckled and silent, and a briefcase heavy with secrets. The rest was just speculation, rumors swirling through a city haunted by what it refused to reveal. Franklin Doyle had vanished, and with him the line between justice and silence blurred once again. In the aftermath of Frank Doyle's disappearance, the city's whispers grew sharper, slicing through union halls and smoky backrooms with an edge honed by suspicion. The police fanned out, interrogating waiters, clerks, and neighbors, but behind closed doors, a different kind of reckoning began. Men who'd once shaken Frank's hand now watched each other with narrowed eyes, every alliance suddenly fragile, every motive up for debate. There were those who had the most to lose if Frank's ambitions ever bore fruit. And in a city built on secrets, 3 names cast the longest shadows. Vincent Romano, known throughout the Eastern Corridor as the man who made the wheels of commerce turn, or, when angered, made them grind to a halt. He had started as a warehouse boy, loading crates for the transport lines, but climbed with ruthless efficiency until he owned more trucks and routes than anyone else in the city. His empire ran on backroom deals and unspoken threats, a spider at the center of a vast, sticky web. Once he and Frank had been allies. There were photos in old union newsletters of the 2 men shaking hands at a ribbon cutting, both of them younger, eyes burning with ambition. But power has a way of souring friendships, and as the years ground on, Romano became less interested in brotherhood and more interested in control. The rumor was, Romano had never forgiven Frank for the time he'd sided with the workers in a bitter strike that cost him millions. And when Frank went to prison, Romano had swept in, taking over contracts and seizing a slice of the city's transport network that he never intended to give back. The day Frank disappeared, Romano was seen at his favorite golf club, entertaining city councilmen and union bosses. He was all smiles and charm, the embodiment of respectability. Yet behind closed doors, his temper was legendary. He hated surprises, and the idea of Frank Doyle returning to challenge his dominance would have been an intolerable affront. Still, when police asked, Romano simply shrugged, claiming he hadn't seen Frank in years. Ancient history, he called it. But those who knew him best watched for the subtle shifts in his voice, the way his jaw tightened just before he changed the subject. Then there was Leo Mancini, a name spoken softly in union halls and shouted in back alley warnings. Mancini had never bothered with legitimate work. He was muscle for hire, the man you called when you needed fear to walk into a room ahead of you. His ties to Detroit's mob ran deep, stretching back to the days when prohibition liquor was smuggled in the city's sewers. Mancini was a bulldog, loyal, brutal, and utterly without remorse. Years ago, he'd cornered Frank in the back lot of a bar, shoving him against the brick wall and hissing a warning that lingered like cigarette smoke. Play ball or pay the price. Nobody ever doubted Mancini's capacity for violence. His hands were marked by scars, his eyes cold as ice melt in spring. After Frank vanished, detectives tracked down Mancini at a low-rent boxing gym in Greektown, the sour smell of sweat hanging heavy in the air. He denied everything with a grunt, returning to his heavy bag with a series of savage blows. He had no use for questions, only results. The truth was, nobody could put him at La Strada that afternoon, but everyone knew Mancini didn't need to be present to send a message. His reach was long, and his enemies had a way of disappearing. The third man, Glenn Porter, played a quieter game, but his ambitions were no less dangerous. As vice president of the union, Porter had built his career on loyalty to whoever happened to be in charge. He was the son of a truck driver, a man who learned early that survival meant watching which way the wind was blowing. Porter was sharp, calculating, always careful to avoid open confrontation. But Frank's return had threatened to unravel everything he'd worked for. Porter's rise to power depended on the old guard staying out of the picture. With Frank sniffing around, Porter's future looked uncertain. When police questioned him, Porter presented an air of wounded innocence. He expressed concern for Frank's family, shook his head sadly, and provided an alibi. A union meeting, full of witnesses and paperwork. But his alibi was thin, barely holding together under scrutiny. Quiet rumors spread that Porter had warned Frank to let sleeping dogs lie, but nobody could prove it. He was the sort of man who always had a contingency plan, a hidden ace ready to play if things went south. 3 men, 3 stories. Each had crossed paths with Frank, each with their own grudges and reasons for keeping him out of power. Romano, with his thirst for total control. Mancini, with his code of violence and loyalty to darker masters. Porter, whose very survival depended on Frank staying gone. None of them admitted guilt. None of them broke under pressure. Their alibis were just strong enough to hold, yet just shaky enough to leave doubt gnawing at the edges. For detectives, it was like trying to pick a lock with gloved hands. Motive was everywhere. Money, power, survival. But hard evidence was nowhere to be found. As the days dragged on, Detroit's underworld seemed to close ranks, every secret sealed tight. Yet in every union hall and neighborhood bar, the same questions lingered in the smoky air. Who had the most to lose if Frank Doyle returned? Who would risk everything to keep him in the shadows? The answers, as ever in Detroit, remained hidden behind closed doors and knowing glances. But the city, restless and watchful, was far from done with its ghosts. The city's rhythm had faltered. Every corner store, union hall, and diner seemed to vibrate with a single question. What happened to Frank Doyle? The morning after the story broke, headlines screamed from every newsstand. Union leader vanishes in broad daylight. Radio hosts speculated with grave voices. TV anchors flashed Frank's photograph. A serious man, graying at the temples, eyes sharp and unresolved. Detroit, so often indifferent to the tragedies that unfolded in its streets, was suddenly, intimately caught up in the fate of one of its own. Rumors bloomed like wildflowers through the working neighborhoods. At corner bars, retired teamsters nursed beers and debated what it all meant. On loading docks, workers leaned on pallets, lowering their voices when supervisors drew near. Some were certain Frank had been taken out for standing up to the mob. They saw him as a martyr, a man who'd gone up against forces that had long controlled the city from behind closed doors. His courage, foolhardy or noble, became a rallying point for those who resented the shadowy influence of organized crime. Others, though, weren't so sure. Some whispered that Frank had seen the writing on the wall, that he'd staged his own escape before the darkness could claim him. The idea took root among those who had never fully trusted him, who remembered his conviction, the rumors of missing money, and suspected that a man could not come back from such things without a plan B. Men like that don't just disappear, one old driver muttered to his friend as they watched a TV news segment over their lunch. Either the mob got him, or he played us all. Every theory fanned the flames. Some claimed they saw strange cars circling the block the night before. Others swore a friend of a friend had seen Frank arguing on the street outside La Strada. The city's rumor mill never slept, and every new detail twisted the narrative a little further from truth. For those who had loved Frank or loathed him, it didn't matter. Everyone wanted to claim a piece of the story. Inside the Doyle home, the days crawled by in slow motion. Marilyn, battered by the media storm, tried to hold the family together. Reporters called day and night, their questions cold and relentless, searching for a crack in her composure. Neighbors dropped off casseroles and condolences, unsure what to say. Marilyn spent long hours at the kitchen table, answering the same questions over and over. Had Frank ever talked about running? Did he have enemies? Had she noticed anything strange? Again and again she insisted, Frank would never abandon his family. He's not that man. Her words became a kind of shield, but doubt gnawed at the edges, growing with each sleepless night. She replayed every moment of their last morning together, the careful knot of his tie, the way he squeezed her hand, the shadow that passed through his eyes. Could he have hidden something so big, even from her? The loneliness of not knowing pressed down, heavy as wet concrete. The investigation only deepened the divide. Some workers at the Union Hall wore black armbands, refusing to clock in until there was word from Frank. They staged small protests, demanding answers, refusing to let the story fade. Others muttered darkly that the trouble was just beginning, that the wrong questions would bring down heat on everyone, that it was safer to keep your head down. People forget, said one janitor quietly as he swept the floor late one night. Detroit moves on. The city always wins. Yet Frank's disappearance was more than a tabloid story. It was a rupture that exposed old wounds. The union was meant to be a brotherhood, but now it was split. Those loyal to Frank's memory and those eager to close ranks and protect their own interests. Meetings turned tense. Long friendships frayed. Men who had stood together on picket lines years before now eyed each other with suspicion. As days stretched into weeks, the mystery became a national obsession. Frank's story appeared in magazines, true crime programs, and radio call-in shows from coast to coast. Everyone had an opinion, a theory, a hunch. The story was big enough for America to see its own anxieties reflected in it. Corruption, betrayal, the power of secrets. The city that prided itself on resilience found itself haunted, unable to let go or move forward. Still, the Doyle house stood as a quiet center in the storm. Each night, Marilyn lit a candle in the window, a beacon for a husband who might never return. She refused to give up hope, even as friends urged her to accept the worst. She clung to the memory of his laugh, the weight of his hand on her shoulder, the stubbornness that both infuriated and protected her all those years. In Detroit, people had learned to survive heartbreak and unanswered questions. But Frank Doyle's disappearance left something different behind. A wound that would not heal, a sense of injustice that demanded resolution. The city was divided, its people left to wonder if the truth was buried in fear, or if, somewhere in the dark, the answers were waiting for someone brave enough to find them. As the days melted into each other, the initial shock of Frank Doyle's disappearance gave way to a grinding uncertainty that settled over Detroit like a late summer haze. The police investigation, which had begun with urgency, soon met the impenetrable walls of rumor, half-truth, and misdirection. With the city itself seemingly conspiring to protect its secrets, even the smallest details became sources of endless speculation. Detectives worked tirelessly, chasing every whisper and rumor that floated through Union halls and echoed down city blocks. Each tip felt like the opening move in a chess game where the pieces kept shifting. The streets surrounding La Strada, once just another quiet suburban stretch, became a focal point, an axis around which 1,000 theories spun. From the beginning, witnesses came forward, some eager, some hesitant, each with a version of events that contradicted the last. A cook from a nearby diner insisted he'd seen Frank in the parking lot after 2 o'clock, deep in conversation with a tall man wearing a gray suit. The cook described the scene as tense, claiming the stranger held an envelope in one hand, gesturing sharply with the other. When pressed for details, the cook's story drifted, but he remained certain. Frank had not left the restaurant alone. Another lead came from a local delivery driver who claimed he was passing by the lot just as the lunch rush faded. In his memory, Frank had climbed into a black sedan, its windows tinted dark enough to obscure whoever sat inside. The car, the driver said, pulled out quickly and merged onto the main road, heading toward I-75. The image burned in his mind, a man leaving, perhaps against his will, perhaps by his own choice. But like so many details in this case, nothing about the sighting could be confirmed. No camera had caught the car's license plate. No other witnesses remembered seeing a black sedan at all. Then, a third account muddied the water further. A woman walking her dog in the adjacent lot claimed to have overheard a heated argument. She described Frank's voice, sharp and raised, clashing with another man's, the words indistinct but unmistakably angry. Her dog had barked, tugging at the leash, drawing her attention to the scene. Just in time to see 2 men gesturing furiously, their faces obscured by distance and glare. But when detectives checked the camera footage, nothing matched the woman's timeline. She was certain of what she'd heard, but the evidence simply wasn't there. 3 witnesses, 3 stories, each plausible, each impossible to reconcile with the others. Every detail seemed to fracture under closer scrutiny, as if the truth itself resisted discovery. Detectives pored over phone logs, questioned every regular at La Strada, and scrutinized security tapes frame by frame. Yet there was nothing definitive, only a series of shadows, moving just out of reach. The press seized on the contradictions, turning Frank Doyle's vanishing act into a media circus. Talk radio callers dissected every sighting and discrepancy, weaving elaborate theories from scraps of overheard conversation and fleeting glimpses. Some believed the city's criminal underworld had orchestrated a masterful disappearance, erasing Frank as punishment or warning. Others clung to the notion that he had engineered his own escape, vanishing to some new life beyond the reach of anyone who ever knew him. The police, for their part, could do little but follow each new lead to another dead end. Even the most basic questions had no answers. Was the envelope an innocent bundle of documents, or something far more sinister? Did Frank willingly enter the black sedan, or was he forced? Was the argument outside La Strada a final confrontation, or just another of the countless disputes that littered his complicated life? Inside the Doyle home, the uncertainty ate away at Marilyn and her family. Each new account brought hope and fear in equal measure. If someone had seen Frank after lunch, perhaps he was still alive, caught up in a plan or desperate bid for safety. If not, the finality of his fate seemed only more certain and terrible. Marilyn read every article, watched every news segment, her mind looping endlessly through possibilities. She wanted closure, yet dreaded the form it might take. As the investigation dragged on, detectives found themselves caught in a maze with no exit. The Union, ever protective of its own, closed ranks. Old friends became tight-lipped. Those who once owed Frank favors now avoided calls from the police. The mob, if it had played a part, left no trace, no threats, no confessions, not even a whispered boast on the wind. The city's code of silence remained as unyielding as ever. In the end, all that remained were fragments, moments frozen in the memories of a few scattered witnesses, each unwilling or unable to give up the whole truth. Without hard evidence, without a body, the case became a story of what-ifs and maybes, a tapestry woven from frayed threads and broken promises. Detectives stood at the edge of the mystery, the cold wind off the Detroit River biting at their faces, and wondered how a man could simply vanish in a city that never truly sleeps. The answer, if it existed, lay buried somewhere between the conflicting testimonies and the silence that followed Frank Doyle into the shadows. An answer just out of reach, waiting for someone with the courage and luck to find it. As summer gave way to autumn, the fever around Frank Doyle's disappearance showed no sign of breaking. What began as a city's obsession soon rippled outward, drawing the attention of federal agents, seasoned journalists, and amateur sleuths alike. The police case files grew thicker by the week, each new theory stacking higher than the last. Yet for all the attention, the truth remained shrouded in fog, leaving only questions and the dark allure of speculation. With no body, no confession, and no clear evidence, Detroit found itself adrift in a sea of chilling possibilities. Coffee counters and barbershops became debate clubs, with regulars turning over every detail, hunting for the thread that would unravel the mystery. Most believed Frank's fate had been sealed long before he entered La Strada. The only question was by whose hand, and for what reason. The most haunting theory was whispered first in the Union halls and then repeated by reporters with grave undertones. Frank Doyle had crossed the wrong people, and Detroit's old mob had decided to make an example of him. The city's history was scarred with tales of men who disappeared, their names lost to concrete and steel. The story went that if you angered the right men, men who answered to no law but their own, you might be driven to an industrial site on the city's edge. A steel mill, a landfill, a vast empty warehouse. There the work would be quiet, clinical, and absolute. Rumors grew of bodies burned in blast furnaces, of men reduced to nothing but memory and smoke. To some, Frank's disappearance fit the pattern perfectly. A lesson from the old world. Power is not challenged without consequence, and loyalty is enforced in blood and silence. But that wasn't the only theory that stalked the city's imagination. Others, especially those who worked close to the union's leadership, saw Frank's crusade as a threat not just to criminals, but to those who wore suits and ties and called themselves respectable. In this version, Frank's investigations into union corruption had struck too close to the heart of a secret empire, a shadowy system of slush funds, cash loans, and off-the-books favors. To protect themselves, the leaders he once called brothers had betrayed him, not out of hatred, but from the cold, calculating logic of self-preservation. They silenced Frank to keep their own secrets hidden, to preserve the fragile peace that kept money flowing and the authorities distracted. Some found this idea even more frightening than mob justice. It meant the line between friend and enemy was paper-thin, that men who once toasted Frank's victories could just as easily order his disappearance when the stakes grew high enough. The thought poisoned every handshake, every meeting in the union offices. Nobody said the word traitor, but it hung in the air, bitter as burnt coffee. Still, a third camp clung to the idea that Frank's story was not a tragedy, but an escape. They scoured the evidence for signs of careful planning. They pointed out that no one had found Frank's wallet, that his most personal papers were missing from the house, that the briefcase in his car was full of information, but contained nothing that tied him, personally, to any damning revelations. Maybe, they said, he'd seen the trap closing and decided to vanish before it was sprung. Perhaps he'd hidden away cash, stashed a new passport, and was now living under an assumed name in a city far from Detroit's reach. It was a theory that brought comfort to some, especially Marilyn, who sometimes clung to the hope that Frank was alive somewhere, waiting for the moment it was safe to return. But when the FBI turned its gaze to the case, even that slender hope began to unravel. Federal agents combed through financial records, bank statements, and years of union payrolls, hunting for any sign that Frank had prepared for a life on the run. They found no evidence, no secret accounts, no unexplained transfers, no sudden purchases of plane tickets or property. The border crossings and flight manifests showed nothing out of the ordinary. If Frank had staged his own disappearance, he'd left not a single trace. The world was no longer friendly to men who vanished without a digital footprint. Every theory seemed to explain a part of the puzzle, but none could fit it all together. Each one left nagging questions, inconsistencies that refused to be smoothed away. The mob might have killed Frank, but why risk the attention on such a high-profile target? The union might have betrayed him, but why leave his car in such a public place? The briefcase a tantalizing clue? And if Frank had truly run, how could a man so deeply rooted in his home, his work, and his marriage simply cut every tie in a single afternoon? As the first chill of winter crept into the city, people started to lose faith that answers would ever come. The case became the stuff of legend, a cautionary tale for anyone who considered challenging the old powers of Detroit. Yet, in back rooms and on late-night radio, the stories never stopped. Each telling grew darker, each theory more elaborate. Frank Doyle's face stared out from yellowing flyers and fading news footage, his story a riddle without end. And so the city moved on, wounded, but not surprised. Detroit had always been a place where men and their secrets could disappear. Yet, beneath the resignation, something colder settled in. The knowledge that sometimes the truth is more terrifying than any fiction, and that in the shadows of power, even a man as strong as Frank Doyle could simply cease to exist. The seasons changed. Leaves turned from green to gold, and then dropped, swirling along the empty sidewalks and pooling against the curbs. Detroit moved with its usual resilience. Cars rumbling along battered roads, factories roaring through shift after shift, the city's heart beating on. Yet in certain corners of the city, in the hush of midnight or the quiet dread before dawn, Frank Doyle's name was still spoken, soft and uncertain, like the memory of thunder after a storm. The police investigation continued, but with every passing month, the momentum waned. Tips came in, then dried up. Forensic teams scoured Frank's car again and again, looking for a trace of blood, a stray fiber, a sign, any sign that violence had taken place. They found nothing. Detectives went back to La Strada, pressing staff for memories, scanning hours of camera footage, searching for something they might have missed. But the trail always ended the same way, with Frank vanishing into a slice of sunlight, then dissolving into legend. In the years that followed, the case became more than a puzzle. It became a haunting, a wound that would not close, a question that refused to be silenced. The Doyle family lived inside that wound. Marilyn kept Frank's photograph on the mantel, a gentle smile frozen in time. Every year, on the anniversary of his disappearance, she would light a candle in the front window. Neighbors sometimes joined her, standing on the porch in silence, a small gesture of solidarity in the face of the unknown. Frank's children grew up carrying the weight of their father's story. At birthdays and graduations, his absence was a silent guest. Sometimes Marilyn caught herself expecting the doorbell to ring, expecting to see him standing there, older, changed, but alive. Hope became a kind of burden, too heavy to put down, too precious to abandon. But outside the Doyle home, the city moved on, as cities must. For law enforcement, Frank's case was filed among the hundreds of cold cases that littered Detroit's history. Detectives retired or were reassigned. New faces took up the old files, their eyes scanning the notes with fresh optimism, only to find themselves tangled in the same dead ends. Still, the case never truly faded. Every few years, a new lead would surface, an anonymous letter, a whispered tip from a jailhouse informant, a rumor overheard in a bar. The police would dig up a field outside the city, search an abandoned warehouse, or drain a muddy pond, always chasing the possibility that this time they might find an answer. In 2008, more than a decade after Frank vanished, the FBI received a tip that sent a team to an industrial site on Detroit's outskirts. Agents, sweating under the summer sun, unearthed several rusted steel barrels half buried in the ground. For a moment, the city held its breath, the newspapers printing headlines in anticipation, families tuning in for news of a breakthrough. But when the barrels were opened, they were empty, no bodies, no evidence, just the faint smell of old oil and disappointment. The search for Frank Doyle had become a ghost hunt. The case joined a long list of unsolved disappearances, stories that haunted Michigan's past. Each was a cautionary tale about ambition, about secrets, about the price men paid for challenging the wrong powers. In coffee shops and at union meetings, the story of Frank's last day became a kind of urban myth, passed from one generation to the next. Some said he was buried beneath a highway. Others believed he was tossed into the river, his bones washed away by the city's currents. A few insisted he was alive, watching from afar, forever on the run. But to those who loved him, and to the detectives who had spent years searching for him, Frank was more than a ghost. He was a question mark, a symbol of all that was unresolved. The city's failure to find him, or even to explain his fate, was a reminder of the limits of justice and the power of silence. In the official records, Frank's file was marked cold case. The papers were boxed and stored away, but the story never truly rested. Marilyn, older now, still lit her candle every August. Sometimes, she would sit by the window, watching the flicker of light and listening to the distant sounds of the city. She knew that the chances of Frank coming home were almost nothing, yet hope, stubborn and unyielding, remained. Detroit, too, carried the wound, scarred but enduring. The factories kept running, the unions kept fighting, the city kept breathing. But in the quiet moments, when the world seemed still, the ghost of Frank Doyle lingered. He haunted the memories of those who remembered the man he was, and the city that failed to protect him. His story was unfinished, a truth buried deep in shadows and silence, waiting, perhaps forever, for someone to finally uncover what really happened that day he vanished from the Motor City. As the years slipped by and hope drained from even the most loyal hearts, Frank Doyle's disappearance settled into a different place in Detroit's collective memory. It was no longer just a family's tragedy or a union's scandal. It became part of something larger, an unsettling echo in the vast halls of American history. In late-night conversations and in true crime documentaries, the name Frank Doyle inevitably conjured another, older legend, Jimmy Hoffa. Jimmy Hoffa, the legendary labor leader and former Teamsters president, had vanished in Michigan more than 20 years before Frank Doyle's last day. It was July 1975, and the country was gripped by the same feverish curiosity, the same fear, that would one day haunt the search for Frank. Hoffa was last seen outside the Machus Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township, only a short drive from the Italian eatery where Frank would meet his own mysterious fate. Like Frank, Hoffa had been a towering figure in the world of unions, admired by many, feared by more, and locked in a lifelong battle with the very forces that had made him powerful. The stories, though separated by decades, were hauntingly similar. Hoffa was scheduled to meet with men tied to the mob, men who owed him favors or nursed old grudges. He parked his car, waited in the lot, and then disappeared into the humid Michigan afternoon. No body was ever found. No credible witness ever came forward, and every promising lead dissolved into rumor and dead ends. The car was discovered later, abandoned, as if Hoffa had simply stepped out of reality and into myth. The parallels with Frank Doyle's vanishing were impossible to ignore. Both men had spent their lives in the shadows and spotlights of organized labor, caught between their own ambitions and the deadly currents of corruption and power. Both men had challenged the wrong enemies at the wrong moment, refusing to bow down or walk away quietly. Both men were last seen in the ordinary places of suburban life, a parking lot, a restaurant, a moment in time preserved only by security cameras and fading memories. But the similarities went deeper than circumstances. Hoffa and Doyle were both men who believed, perhaps stubbornly, that right could triumph over might. They had made friends and enemies in equal measure. They trusted too easily, or not at all. When the world turned against them, they fought back, not always wisely, but always bravely. And in the end, their greatest battles were not in boardrooms or picket lines, but in the final moments when they faced the abyss of betrayal, silence, and disappearance. For Detroit and for America, these stories became more than cautionary tales. They were warnings etched into the city's bones. Hoffa's fate had become the gold standard of American mysteries. His name was spoken in every Union hall, his story the stuff of speculation and nightmares. Was he buried beneath Giants Stadium? Did his remains lie at the bottom of a Great Lakes landfill? Was he melted in a steel furnace, reduced to nothingness by the very machines he once helped command? Every few years, a new break in the case would send reporters and police rushing to dig up some lonely field or half-collapsed warehouse, always returning empty-handed. So when Frank Doyle vanished, it was only natural that his story would be woven into the tapestry of Hoffa's legend. The two men were seen as bookends to an era of labor, one that was noble and corrupt, brave and doomed, larger than life and, in the end, fatally vulnerable. Their disappearances became part of Detroit's uneasy mythology, the city's twin ghosts. Both men haunted the spaces they left behind, the parking lots, the union halls, the homes where families waited for a knock on the door that never came. For the Doyle family, these comparisons brought little comfort. Marilyn resented the way journalists drew parallels, reducing Frank to a footnote in someone else's tragedy. Her pain was not the stuff of legends. It was personal, raw, and unending. Yet, as the anniversaries accumulated and the silence grew heavier, she understood the need to keep Frank's name alive, to insist that his story mattered, that his absence was not just another cold case file gathering dust in a city of shadows. The questions that had haunted Hoffa's family and friends now belonged to the Doyles too. How could a man with so many ties simply vanish? How could the police, the FBI, the world itself fail to find answers when the stakes were so high? What secrets were powerful enough to swallow two men whole, leaving behind only rumors and sorrow? For the people of Detroit, these cases became a measure of the city's soul, a reminder that some battles for justice were never finished, that some truths could be buried deeper than any grave. Each new generation heard the stories, saw the newsreels, and wondered if the city would ever give up its ghosts. Yet even as time wore away the sharp edges of pain, the memories of Frank Doyle and Jimmy Hoffa endured, bound together by mystery, loss, and the haunting sense that some shadows can never be chased away. In the end, the stories of Frank Doyle and Jimmy Hoffa settled like dust across the map of Michigan, a quiet, persistent ache that never truly faded. The city carried their memories as scars, invisible to the eye but always present in the way people locked their doors at night, or the careful hush that fell whenever the words disappearance, union, or mob crept into conversation. For Detroit, these were not just tales of vanished men. They were warnings, woven deep into the city's soul. Frank's absence became a living presence in the lives of those he left behind. Marilyn's world shrank to the candle she lit each August, the echo of Frank's footsteps in her dreams, the muted clink of dishes at a table set for one less. She clung to the rituals of memory, airing out his suits every spring, dusting his old briefcase, telling their grandchildren stories about the man who once stood so tall in the city's storm. Each year, fewer friends stopped by to pay respects. The news crews and reporters found fresher tragedies. But for the Doyle family, grief was not a headline. It was a lifelong companion. The Union halls, too, bore Frank's ghost. Younger men came and went. New leaders took their seats at long, battered tables, and still the old stories were told in quiet corners. "Remember Doyle?" someone would mutter when negotiations turned dangerous or threats lingered in the air. Some men believed Frank's fate was a lesson about pride, a cautionary tale about overreaching in a world ruled by shadows. Others remembered him as a fighter, the last of a breed who believed justice was worth the risk, even when the cost was everything. And always, Detroit's rumor mill kept spinning. Some said Frank's bones lay under concrete, sealed in foundations poured by men who never asked questions. Others believed he was gone far away, living in some sun-bleached town under a different name, too proud or too scared to ever return. No evidence surfaced. No confessions came. No secret diaries emerged to solve the puzzle. The city moved on, but the questions never stopped gnawing at the edges of collective memory. Perhaps that is the true cost of these disappearances, the way they blur the line between truth and legend, how they leave wounds that never quite heal. In a world of hard facts and instant answers, Frank Doyle's story was a stubborn riddle. It reminded people that sometimes justice is not a courtroom verdict or a breaking news alert. Sometimes it's the silent candle in a window, the faith that somewhere out there, the truth still matters, even if no one will ever hear it spoken aloud. For the detectives and agents who spent years chasing ghosts, the lesson was a bitter one. They had dug up fields, drained lakes, turned over every stone in hope of bringing closure to a family, to a city. Each time they came up empty, the silence grew heavier. Their official files closed, but the story refused to die. Even now, old officers sometimes drove past La Strada or the abandoned lots along the river, wondering if the answers were still out there, hidden just beneath the surface. Maybe Frank Doyle's final resting place is steel and earth, somewhere deep in the city's veins. Maybe he's ash carried on the wind through neighborhoods he once fought for. Or perhaps he's simply lost in the fog of memory, a name whispered in the dark, a question that no one can answer, but everyone is afraid to stop asking. For the city, the lesson lingered. Power is dangerous, and the darkness behind it can swallow men whole. No body, no justice. Only families left with grief that grows old without ever growing soft. Only stories, passed from one generation to the next, each retelling smoothing the edges until legend and truth are one and the same. So the haunting question endures, echoing through union halls, family kitchens, and the city's restless nights. Who took them, and why? And in that silence, a final note for all who listen. If you want more chilling cold case stories like this, subscribe and hit the bell icon, because sometimes truth is far scarier than fiction.